In the summer of 1971, in the windowless basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, a thin line between civilian life and systemic cruelty was deliberately erased. Dr. Philip Zimbardo set out to answer a fundamental question of the human condition. What happens when you put good people in an evil place? Does the person make the place, or does the place make the person? This was the genesis of the Stanford Prison Experiment, a study that would become a cultural touchstone for the darkness inherent in authority, yet one that remains shrouded in controversy, ethical nightmares, and allegations of theatrical manipulation. To understand the monster created at Stanford, one must first understand the social climate of the era. The United States was reeling from the psychological aftermath of the Milgram obedience studies and the horrific revelations of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. The public was desperate to know how ordinary men could commit extraordinary atrocities. Zimbardo, a charismatic young professor, recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper ad, offering $15 a day to participate in a psychological study of prison life. These were not troubled youths. They were screened for stability, physical health, and lack of criminal history. They were the cream of the crop, randomly assigned by the flip of a coin to be either a prisoner or a guard. The transformation began before the first cell door even locked. To simulate the trauma of arrest, Zimbardo collaborated with the Palo Alto Police Department. Real officers conducted arrests at the participants' homes, charging them with armed robbery, frisking them on their front lawns, and transporting them in squad cars. At the mock prison, the prisoners were stripped naked, deloused with spray, and forced to wear heavy smocks with no undergarments, a tactic designed to emasculate and disorient. They were no longer names, they were numbers sewn onto their chests. The guards, conversely, were outfitted in identical khaki uniforms and silver-reflecting sunglasses, a barrier that provided de-individuation, the psychological cloak of anonymity that allows a human to feel detached from their own moral compass. What was intended to be a 14-day observation collapsed into chaos in less than a week. The guards, given no specific training other than to maintain order and command respect, quickly innovated forms of psychological torture that Zimbardo himself had not anticipated. They used fire extinguishers to quell a second-day rebellion, forced prisoners to sleep on concrete floors, and restricted bathroom privileges, eventually forcing inmates to use buckets in their cells that they were then forbidden from emptying. The air in the basement grew thick with the smell of waste and the palpable weight of hopelessness. The monsters were not born, they were modeled. One guard, nicknamed John Wayne for his aggressive Southern accent and swaggering cruelty, became a catalyst for the others. He later claimed he was simply performing a role, pushing the limits to see how much the researchers would allow. This raises the most haunting question of the experiment. Where did the science end and the theater begin? The prisoners began to suffer from learned helplessness, a state where they stopped attempting to escape or resist because they believed their situation was immutable. Within 36 hours, the first prisoner suffered a total emotional breakdown, uncontrollable crying, screaming, and disorganized thinking. He had to be released. As the days bled together, the researchers themselves became victims of the environment they created. Zimbardo, acting as the prison superintendent rather than a detached scientist, became more concerned with the security of his prison than the welfare of his subjects. He admitted later that he had lost his objective perspective. It wasn't until his girlfriend, China Maslach, a fellow psychologist who visited the basement on the fifth day, expressed horror at the dehumanization she witnessed, that Zimbardo snapped back to reality. He realized he had become a part of the very machine he was trying to study. The experiment was terminated on the sixth day. In the decades since, the Stanford Prison Experiment has faced intense scrutiny and accusations of being a sham. Investigative journalists and psychologists have unearthed recordings suggesting that guards were actively coached by Zimbardo's assistants to be tough and unyielding, implying that the guards weren't naturally devolving into monsters, but were instead following the instructions of their boss. If the guards were simply following orders to be cruel, the experiment becomes less a study on the banality of evil and more a study on the power of leadership and demand characteristics. Furthermore, many participants later admitted to faking breakdowns or acting out roles they thought the scientists wanted to see. Yet, even if the methodology was flawed, the legacy of the experiment persists because it resonates with a terrifying truth we see in the real world. From the halls of Abu Ghraib to the systemic failures of modern carceral systems. It suggests that the uniforms we wear and the roles we are assigned can swallow our identities whole. If you give a human absolute power over another and remove the guardrails of accountability, the monster isn't an intruder. It is a dormant potential living within the structure of the institution itself. The Stanford prison experiment remains a grim reminder that our morality is often a fragile luxury, highly dependent on the walls that surround us. The transition from ordinary student to oppressor or victim was fueled by a phenomenon known as de-individuation. When the guards donned their silver-reflecting sunglasses, they weren't just wearing an accessory. They were wearing a mask that granted them a psychological divorce from their personal identities. In the eyes of the prisoners, the guards ceased to be individuals and became a monolithic wall of authority. This lack of eye contact and the suppression of facial expressions allowed the guards to behave in ways they never would have in their civilian lives. They were no longer Dave or John from the psych department. They were the embodiment of the state. On the other side of the bars, the prisoners underwent a parallel process of dehumanization. By replacing their names with numbers, Zimbardo stripped away their history, their status, and their humanity. When a prisoner is referred to only as 819 or 416, it becomes exponentially easier for those in power to ignore their suffering. The physical environment played a crucial role here as well. The hole, a tiny dark storage closet used for solitary confinement, became a symbol of the guards' total control over the prisoner's physical reality. In this sensory-deprived space, the passage of time warped, and the distinction between a psychological study and an inescapable nightmare evaporated. One of the most chilling aspects of the research was the good guard syndrome. Even those guards who were described as fair or passive never once intervened to stop the cruelty of their more sadistic peers. They didn't provide extra food or challenge the arbitrary punishments. Their silence became a form of complicity that reinforced the hierarchy. This highlights a terrifying social reality. You don't need an entire group of villains to create a hellscape. You only need a few active aggressors and a majority of people willing to look the other way to maintain the status quo. This bystander effect within a power structure is what allowed the basement to descend into a state of nature where the only law was the whim of the person holding the nightstick. The psychological toll on the prisoners manifested in what clinicians now recognize as acute situational trauma. Prisoner 819 provides the most haunting case study. After experiencing a breakdown, he was placed in a room to rest, while Zimbardo prepared to release him. In the hallway, the guards lined up the other prisoners and forced them to chant in unison. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Because of what Prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess. When 819 heard this chant, he began to sob uncontrollably, refusing to leave because he felt he had to prove he wasn't a bad prisoner. He had become so enmeshed in the simulation that the opinion of the mock prison population mattered more to him than his actual freedom. It took Zimbardo shaking him and saying, "Listen, you are not 819. You are Nay, and I am a professor," to break the spell. Critically, the experiment's validity is often challenged by the concept of demand characteristics. The idea that participants subconsciously change their behavior to fit what they believe the researchers want. Critics argue that the students weren't revealing the dark side of human nature, but were instead acting out a stereotypical version of prison life they had seen in movies like Cool Hand Luke. If the guards believed that the success of Zimbardo's study depended on them being tough, then their cruelty was a form of cooperation rather than a natural instinct. However, this critique arguably makes the results more frightening, not less. It suggests that humans are so eager to please authority figures and fulfill social roles that they will voluntarily engage in cruelty just because they think it's part of the job. As we look at the legacy of the Stanford prison experiment in the 21st century, we must grapple with its ethical wreckage. The study would be impossible to conduct today under modern Institutional Review Board (IRB) standards. The lack of informed consent regarding the police arrests and the failure to provide a clear exit for participants who wanted to leave are viewed as massive failures of scientific ethics. Yet the data gathered, however tainted, continues to serve as a warning. It forces us to examine the monsters, not as anomalies, but as products of the systems we build. When we design environments that lack accountability, when we strip people of their names, and when we grant unchecked power to the guards of our society, we are essentially recreating the Stanford basement on a global scale. The ultimate lesson of Stanford isn't that people are inherently evil. It's that human nature is terrifyingly plastic. We are capable of profound empathy, but we are also capable of chilling detachment if the situation demands it. The monsters weren't created by science, they were revealed by it. The basement showed us that the line between a good person and a monster is not a permanent barrier, but a fragile boundary that can be moved by something as simple as a uniform, a pair of sunglasses, and the permission of an authority figure. The internal architecture of the experiment was built on a foundation of role theory, but it was the specific interactions between the most defiant prisoner and the most sadistic guard that truly illuminated the psychological warfare at play. Enter Prisoner 416, a standby recruit who was brought in as a replacement midway through the study. Unlike the original group, who had been gradually boiled like frogs in the rising heat of the prison's atmosphere, 416 entered a world that was already mad. To him, the behavior of the guards wasn't a developing social contract, it was immediate, irrational abuse. He responded with the only weapon he had left, his body. He went on a hunger strike. The guards' reaction to 416's hunger strike shifted the experiment from a study of roles into a study of systemic breaking points. They didn't view his refusal to eat as a protest of conscience, but as a management problem. The John Wayne guard, whose real name was Dave Eshelman, took this as a personal challenge to his authority. Eshelman didn't just punish 416, he tried to turn the other prisoners against him. He forced the inmates to chant that 416 was a troublemaker and offered a sadistic choice. The prisoners could either give up their blankets for the night or 416 would remain in solitary confinement. In a heartbreaking display of the erosion of solidarity, the majority of the prisoners chose to keep their blankets. They had been conditioned to see the rebel as the source of their pain, rather than the guards who were actually inflicting it. This specific moment, the betrayal of a peer for a shred of comfort, is where the monster truly takes shape. It isn't just the man in the uniform, it is the environment that makes the victim complicit in their own oppression. Eshelman later reflected on his behavior with a chilling level of detachment. He described his John Wayne persona as a deliberate creative exercise. He wanted to see how far he could push the experiment before someone in a lab coat told him to stop. But the lab coats never did. By remaining silent, Zimbardo and his staff provided institutional validation for the cruelty. In the absence of a no, the human mind assumes a yes. This is the psychological mechanism behind many historical atrocities. The assumption that if the people in charge aren't stopping it, it must be right, or at least it must be necessary. To understand the depth of the research, we must also look at the interrogation of the prisoners' identities. The guards began to use creative punishments that targeted the prisoners' sense of self-worth. They forced them to clean toilet bowls with their bare hands, or to spend hours doing repetitive, meaningless tasks like moving thorns from one pile to another. These were not security measures. They were degradation rituals. The goal of a degradation ritual is to replace an individual's complex internal life with a single, simplified status, subject. When a person is reduced to a set of repetitive, physical motions under the gaze of an overseer, the higher-order functions of the brain, reasoning, moral judgment, and future planning, begin to shut down. The prisoner enters a state of chronic stress, where the only goal is survival through submission. As the experiment reached its final hours, the line between Zimbardo the scientist and Zimbardo the superintendent became non-existent. There is a recorded instance where a rumor spread that the released prisoners were planning a jailbreak to liberate their friends. Instead of treating this as a fascinating data point of prisoner solidarity, Zimbardo reacted with genuine paranoia. He attempted to contact the real police to move his inmates to a more secure location. When the police refused, he sat in the dark basement waiting for the attack, angry that his prison was being threatened. This is perhaps the most profound finding of the Stanford prison experiment, that even the person who designs the trap is not immune to getting caught in it. The creator of the monster eventually finds himself looking in the mirror and seeing the same distorted features. The aftermath of the study was a whirlwind of academic fame and ethical infamy. While Zimbardo used the results to advocate for prison reform and to testify in trials like that of the Abu Ghraib guards, the psychological community began to tear the study apart. Recent archival discoveries of the Zimbardo tapes suggest that the guards were actually given a set of rules that encouraged them to be psychologically oppressive. One assistant was caught on tape telling a guard that the researchers really need the guards to be tough for the sake of the data. This revelation transforms the experiment from a discovery of innate human darkness into a demonstration of compliance to scientific authority. It suggests that we don't become monsters because we want to, but because we are told that our monstrosity serves a higher purpose, in this case, the purpose of science. The legacy of the Stanford prison experiment transitioned from a closed-circuit basement drama to a global blueprint for understanding systemic abuse when the world saw the photos from Abu Ghraib in 2004. Philip Zimbardo himself noted the shocking parallels between the behavior of the American military police and his student guards. In both cases, the perpetrators were not inherently bad apples. Rather, they were placed in a bad barrel. The environment lacked oversight, the roles were clearly defined by a power imbalance, and the victims were stripped of their individuality. This comparison reinforces the Lucifer Effect, the idea that the line between good and evil is permeable and that almost anyone can be induced to cross it under the right situational pressures. However, the modern era of psychology has brought a replicability crisis that threatens the very foundation of Zimbardo's conclusions. In 2018, French academic Thibault Letexier published The History of a Lie, based on archived documents from Stanford. His research revealed that the spontaneous cruelty of the guards was often carefully choreographed. For instance, the infamous John Wayne guard, Dave Eshelman, didn't just stumble upon his persona. He was explicitly told by the research team that his performance was exactly what they needed. The researchers weren't just observers, they were the directors of a macabre play. This suggests that the monster created at Stanford wasn't a product of human nature, but a product of obedience to authority, specifically the authority of the scientist. This shift in perspective actually makes the study more relevant to the 21st century. If the guards were acting out of a desire to please Zimbardo, then the experiment is less about innate evil and more about the bureaucratic evil of the modern workplace or military. It shows how easily people will suspend their own moral judgment if they believe their actions are serving a noble cause, such as scientific progress or national security. The monster isn't a werewolf that emerges when the moon is full. It's a clerk who files the paperwork for an execution because that's what his job description demands. This banality of evil, a term coined by Hannah Arendt, is the true ghost haunting the Stanford basement. Despite the criticisms, the experiment remains an essential cautionary tale because it forced the scientific community to adopt rigorous ethical standards. Today, the informed consent process ensures that participants are fully aware of the risks and have an absolute right to withdraw at any time without penalty, protections that were tragically absent in 1971. The Stanford prison experiment serves as the ground zero for research ethics, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge does not grant a license to break the human spirit. We learn that science itself can become a mask for cruelty if it is not tethered to a strict moral framework. As we look back at those 6 days in Palo Alto, we are left with a sobering realization about the architecture of our society. Every day we step into roles, boss, employee, citizen, stranger, that come with invisible scripts. The monsters of Stanford were college students who liked music, had families, and went to class. They were us. The experiment's enduring power lies in its ability to make us uncomfortable with ourselves. It asks us to consider, if we were given the sunglasses and the nightstick and told that the system required us to be cruel, would we have the strength to say no? Or would we, too, disappear into the uniform? The Stanford prison experiment didn't just create monsters. It gave us a mirror. And for over 50 years, we have been staring into that mirror, trying to decide if we recognize the face looking back at us. It remains a definitive study not because of its scientific perfection, but because of its raw, ugly truth, that the capacity for darkness is not a bug in the human system, but a feature of the environments we choose to build and the roles we agree to play.